We're going to take a look at the hormone interactions in the menstrual cycle in this video. So there's two hormones that have some interactions in the menstrual cycle. The first one is estrogen, and estrogen is doing a lot of things. So there's some negative feedback effects from estrogen, positive feedback effects. Estrogen is also permissive to LH, so it permits LH to work, and it's also permissive to progesterone. So it permits progesterone to work by telling the uterus to put progesterone receptors out. And then progesterone has some interactions as well, but it's much easier. So there's just a negative feedback effect from progesterone. So let's just take a look at what's going on in the ovary during the menstrual cycle. You don't have to know everything that's on this slide. All you really need to know are just what we talk about, and that's it. So in the ovary, we've got the follicles, and these are the eggs. And a woman is born with all of the follicles that she's ever going to have at birth, and she won't develop anymore. And each month, several of these follicles will be stimulated to develop, and they will start growing, and one of them will become dominant and take over, and then the rest of the ones that were developing will then just kind of disintegrate. And then the one that keeps developing will grow, and then ovulation will occur, and the egg will get released into the fallopian tube. And then where the egg was, what remains of that follicle in the ovary develops into what's called the corpus luteum. And that literally means yellow body. So corpus is body and luteum means yellow. And the corpus luteum will remain if the woman becomes pregnant, but if she does not become pregnant, then the corpus luteum will disintegrate, and then the menstrual cycle will start over for the next cycle. So there's two cycles going on in the menstrual cycle. There's an ovarian cycle and a uterine cycle. So let's take a look at the ovarian cycle first. And as far as what's happening in the ovary, we're going to divide it into two phases. We have the follicular phase and the luteal phase. So we're just going with an average 28-day menstrual cycle, and we women know that it's not always 28 days, so it can vary. But just on average with a 28-day cycle, the follicular phase is pretty easy to remember, because that's when the follicle, the egg, is developing. And it's going to end when ovulation occurs, so when the egg is released. And then the luteal phase comes next, and that's when the corpus luteum is around. And that will last until the corpus luteum disintegrates, and then we start all over with the follicular phase again. So the ovarian cycle is pretty easy to remember. Okay, and then we have a uterine cycle as well. So there's three phases here, and what's happening in the uterus. So days 1 through 5, that's the menstrual phase. So what's happening here is the endometrium, the lining of the uterus, is being shed and bleeding is occurring. And then days 5 through 14 is the proliferative phase. So this is when the endometrium, the uterine lining, starts to build back up again. And this will end at ovulation. And then days 14 through 28 is going to be the secretory phase. So there's some glands in the endometrium that will develop, and they will start secreting glycogen and other things that the embryo would need to develop and implant in case the woman got pregnant. So the secretory phase is there in case the woman got pregnant. And then if the woman does not become pregnant, then the blood vessels supporting this thickened endometrium will constrict, and that endometrial layer will die and then slough off, and the menstrual phase will begin again. You don't have to remember the exact days. I'm not going to ask you that. I would just expect you to know like what's going on in the menstrual phase or what's going on in the proliferative phase or the secretory phase, but I'm not going to ask you the exact days. Okay, so let's just draw out what's going on with all of the hormones in the menstrual cycle and kind of get an overall big picture here. So again, everything is going to start with our hypothalamus, and we've got the hypothalamic hormone, gonadotropin releasing hormone being released. So that's GnRH. So hypothalamus will release GnRH into the portal system, and then GnRH will travel down to the anterior pituitary, hop off, and then we'll tell the anterior pituitary gland to secrete two hormones here. And we've got different cells in the anterior pituitary. Some will release LH, and then some will release FSH. And so those will get secreted into the blood. So GnRH will tell the anterior pituitary to release both LH and FSH. And then LH and FSH are going to travel through the blood, and they will go over to the ovary. Okay, and what they're going to be doing there, FSH, remember that stands for follicle stimulating hormone. So FSH is going to stimulate the follicle or the egg to start developing and growing. Okay, and as that follicle develops and grows, it's going to start secreting the hormone estrogen. Okay, and then estrogen will act back on the ovary to further help the egg develop. And then estrogen is also going to act on the uterine lining, the endometrium, and stimulate that proliferative phase of the uterine cycle. So it'll help thicken the uterine lining. And then LH, luteinizing hormone, will go to the ovary, and it's going to stimulate the production of estrogen as well. And the estrogen levels are going to be rising, and initially estrogen is going to have a negative feedback effect on the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary. So that'll decrease the amount of GnRH and the LH and FSH that are being secreted. But the egg, the follicle keeps getting bigger, it keeps producing more estrogen, and pretty soon the estrogen levels start getting really high. And then we're going to switch over, and now estrogen, instead of having a negative feedback effect, is going to have a positive feedback effect on the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary. So that'll increase the secretion of GnRH and LH and FSH. And what's really important with this positive feedback from the estrogen is that's what's going to cause our LH surge. And the LH surge is going to trigger ovulation and release of the egg into the fallopian tube and then down into the uterus. Okay, and then once the egg has been released, what develops from the follicle that's left in the ovary is the corpus luteum, that yellow body. And the corpus luteum is going to start producing some progesterone. And also some estrogen as well. And the progesterone is going to act on the uterine lining, that endometrium, and cause the secretory phase of the uterine cycle. So it'll start increasing the glands in that endometrium, and they'll start secreting glycogen to help nourish the embryo if the egg gets fertilized. And the progesterone is also going to have a negative feedback effect on the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary. So it'll decrease the secretion of GnRH and LH and FSH. Okay. So that's kind of the overall big picture of where all these hormones are coming from. So I definitely would know, which endocrine gland is secreting which hormone, where they're acting, where they're going, and what they're doing. Okay, and we're going to go over this as we go here too. Okay, so let's take a look at these graphs of the hormones, and then there's also a picture of the uterine lining here we'll be looking at, and then also what's going on in the ovary. And there's also a really nice video here that goes through the menstrual cycle. It also talks about what happens if you're on the pill as well. So that's a nice video to check out. Okay, so let's go through and talk about what's going on in these graphs with our hormones. And we're going to start actually at the end of our menstrual cycle here. So we're going to be over here. So notice that our estrogen and progesterone levels have decreased, and that's going to be triggering the menstrual phase of the uterine cycle. So we're going to be starting over here. Day 1 is actually over here, and this would be 28 over here. Okay, so day 28, the woman did not get pregnant, and our corpus luteum has disintegrated, and the corpus luteum was actually producing the estrogen and progesterone here on this top graph, and they've now decreased. And so now that negative feedback effect is gone. And so also that's going to decrease that support we had for the endometrial lining, and now we're going to trigger that menstrual phase of the uterine cycle. So we'll start the bleeding on day 1. And also because we've gotten rid of that negative feedback effect from the estrogen and progesterone on the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary, our LH and FSH levels begin to rise here. Okay, and remember that the FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, that's going to go over to the ovary and stimulate the follicles to start developing. Okay, and as these follicles start to develop, they're going to start producing estrogen. And then also the LH is also going to help the follicle produce some estrogen as well. And the estrogen will further help the egg develop. And then also the estrogen is going to go to the uterine lining, that endometrium, and cause that proliferative phase of the uterine cycle. So it'll stimulate the uterine wall to start thickening and getting ready to, possibly implant an embryo. Okay, and then if you notice up here on the top, notice that our estrogen levels are starting to rise. Okay, and that estrogen is being produced by the follicle, okay, that's in the ovary. And so far, we haven't been producing any progesterone yet. Okay, the follicle is not producing any progesterone. Okay, and right now we've got, with our estrogen, as our estrogen is rising, we've got negative feedback. So that estrogen is going to come back onto some of the estrogen is coming from the ovary. And it's going to have a negative feedback effect on the hypothalamus and a negative feedback effect on that anterior pituitary. And remember, we've got GnRH being released by the hypothalamus, and then we've got FSH and LH being released by the anterior pituitary. So if we take a look on our bottom graph, notice that the FSH levels start to go down, and then also our LH levels are kind of staying steady, and there's actually another hormone called inhibin that is making the FSH level go down even further than the LH levels, which I'm not going to ask you about inhibin, so don't worry about that. Okay, we've got enough going on here. All right, so LH and FSH are rising at first, but then they either level off or start to go down because of the negative feedback, because of the rising levels of estrogen being produced by this follicle. Okay, and as this follicle gets even bigger, it produces even more estrogen, and so the estrogen levels get even higher. So you can see that they're going to rise even more, and you get to a point where the negative feedback will then switch over to positive feedback. So what happens is there's some neurons in the hypothalamus that when the estrogen levels get high enough, that high level of estrogen will stimulate those neurons in the hypothalamus, and then they will tell the hypothalamus, hey, go ahead and release your GnRH. Okay, and then the hypothalamus releasing GnRH will then tell the anterior pituitary to release the LH and FSH. Okay, and so then we get our LH surge. Okay, and we do get a little surge of FSH, which, you know, that's not going to do anything. It's the LH surge that we're concerned about here. Okay, and this LH surge, that's what's going to trigger ovulation and release of the egg into the fallopian tube. Okay, and right before ovulation, we do get a little decrease here in the estrogen being produced, and that's just because the egg, as it's getting ready to be ovulated, stops producing quite as much estrogen. And then once it is ovulated, then it doesn't produce as much estrogen at all. Okay, and then that will stop that LH surge because we lose that positive feedback. Okay, so that's what turns that one off. Okay, so then once we've ovulated the egg, what's remaining where the follicle was in the ovary, we've got the corpus luteum. So our corpus luteum here, the yellow body, that is going to start producing estrogen as well as progesterone. Okay, so progesterone is here in blue. And the progesterone has a very strong negative feedback effect. Okay, so this progesterone is being produced by the corpus luteum that's in the ovary, and it's going to have a negative feedback effect on the hypothalamus and also on the anterior pituitary. So that's going to keep the LH and FSH levels low. And that makes sense because we don't want to have another LH surge because we've already released the egg and we don't want to be developing more eggs right now and ovulating them because we've already released one. So we don't want to have another LH surge right in here. So we've got this negative feedback coming from progesterone, and that'll prevent that negative feedback coming again, or that will prevent another LH surge from coming again from the estrogen being high here. Okay, so negative feedback from progesterone will prevent another LH surge, okay, because we don't want to have another egg being ovulated there. Okay, and then the other thing that progesterone is doing is that it goes to the endometrium, the lining of the uterus, and it causes this secretory phase. So it causes the glands in the endometrium to develop and start secreting glycogen, which will feed the implanted embryo and nourish it, and just getting the uterine lining ready in case the egg does get fertilized and implants. Okay, so that's what the progesterone is doing. Okay, and then if the woman does not get pregnant, then the corpus luteum will disintegrate. And as it disintegrates, it stops producing estrogen and progesterone. And so if the estrogen and progesterone disappear, their negative feedback effects are gone, and now the hypothalamus can secrete GnRH and tell the anterior pituitary to release LH and FSH. And so the LH and FSH levels start to rise, and then we'll just start the next menstrual cycle all over again. And so we'll pick some more follicles to start developing. We've also, the estrogen and progesterone are needed to support the uterine lining, and if they're gone, then the blood vessels constrict and the uterine lining will die and slough off, and that causes the menstrual bleeding the first couple of days here of the menstrual cycle. So we just start everything all over and go again. Okay, so I definitely would know what's going on in these graphs. When we have negative feedback, positive feedback, which hormone is doing what, the LH surge causing ovulation, and what causes the LH surge. So that would be a good question to know the answer to. Okay, and remember this LH surge is caused by the positive feedback from the estrogen. Okay, and then also know, on the graph up here on the top, what's being produced by the follicle and then what's being produced by the corpus luteum as well. So that would be important to know too. Okay. And then I've got a summary of this graph, and it's labeled and it walks you through each point on these graphs. So you might want to download that and make sure you study that as well. So that goes through everything. Okay. All right. Just how the pill works, because this is a very common method of birth control. What's in the pill? Some of the pills just have progesterone in them, and others are a combination of estrogen and progesterone. So how they work, because now you understand how the menstrual cycle works. So when you're taking the pill, maybe we have one that just contains progesterone. So on day 1, you start taking the pill and you're just taking progesterone, and so you end up with these high levels, well, relatively high levels of progesterone. And those high levels of progesterone, remember, have a negative feedback effect. Okay, so remember on our hypothalamus and anterior pituitary here, with our GnRH and the LH and FSH. So the progesterone is going to prevent an LH surge. So it's going to keep the LH and FSH levels really low. And so you don't get an LH surge and there's no ovulation. So an egg does not get released. And that's going to prevent pregnancy. And so usually they have you taking these pills for about 21 days. And then there's about 7 days where you take like a placebo that doesn't have the progesterone in it. And then the FSH and LH levels will rise, but then you start back on to the progesterone again, and it's not enough time to get an LH surge. And then in that 7 days, you'll have menstrual bleeding. And some of them, you just keep going with the progesterone the whole time, and you don't stop with the progesterone, and so you actually don't have menstrual bleeding at all. So some of them will do that. And if you have a pill that has estrogen in it, then the estrogen and progesterone will just kind of mirror each other. So they would both be like this. So you'd have both of them in there. So that's how the pill works and prevents pregnancy. So it prevents ovulation, and if there's no egg ovulated, then you can't get pregnant. Okay, and then these are just some flow charts from your book from chapter 22 that you can look over. And then this is just a really nice summary from a different book that just goes through and just talks about each of the phases in the menstrual cycle, and just talks about what's going on with the hormones, and then also what's going on in the ovary, and then what's going on in the uterus as well. So this will be good to review too.